All right, so this is session 7. We're talking today about mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. That's a lot of content, but hopefully we can keep up with all of that. This is not a chart that you need to memorize or anything, but I just wanted to kind of connect this concept back to some of what we talked about in our very first session, which is that companies have these different business units, and those business units have a standalone value, and then they have a synergy value that incorporates not just the value that they can create on their own, but the value of the synergies that they can create with other businesses within the same firm or even between firms. This connects to the idea of acquisitions, in that a company being sold should be sold for somewhere between these 2 points. It certainly should not be sold for below the standalone value. That probably doesn't happen a whole lot. On the other end is the synergy value. A buyer certainly doesn't want to pay more than they expect the unit is worth, including the synergy value. However, when a business unit is bought or sold, the synergy value is an expectation that has not yet been realized, whereas this standalone value hopefully is fairly objective. A key difference with acquisitions over other types of joint operation is that some people capture their share of this value or the expected value upfront. So those that are selling the business unit, the target shareholders, capture their share of the expected synergies upfront, whereas the buyers are paying for a share of those synergies before they've been realized and are taking on more risk. So if the actual synergy value is lower, then the acquiring company captures less value than they had expected. But also if the synergy value is higher, they capture more value than is expected. So that's part of what makes acquisitions relatively risky for companies. If you think back to the synergistic portfolio framework, one of the things that increases the threshold up or down is the risk involved. So if you are buying a unit with the expectation of creating synergies, you need to be pretty confident that the size of the synergies you're getting to create and your share of the value from those will justify the risk in making an acquisition. This next slide is about trade-offs in the post-merger integration process. Specifically, there are decreasing returns to collaboration. Here, collaboration just means joint operation or the creation of synergies. If you start with the most valuable synergy that you can create, and then move to the second most valuable and then the third most valuable, each of those is going to have a smaller incremental benefit to the company. So you have this decreasing marginal returns to greater levels of synergy. The other side, you have increasing costs of disruption for creating these synergies. So the first synergy might be the least disruptive, but as you create more and more synergies, you need to reallocate resources more aggressively, move people around more, modify resources to a greater extent. So the costs of disruption increase with greater integration. Because you have decreasing marginal utility and increasing marginal cost, there's some optimal level of integration where the total benefit minus the total cost is maximized. I think that's pretty straightforward, kind of connects straight back to some of your introductory economics courses. One thing that I want to emphasize about this, though, is that there could be time compression diseconomies here. So creating a given amount of integration in 1 month versus 1 year could be much more costly if you're doing it very quickly. That could create more chaos, more things can go wrong. If you slow it down, you may be able to achieve the same level of integration with less disruption. Another reason for taking your time with integration is that the consequences of a lot of decisions may be irreversible. So if you remember back to our discussion of Disney and Pixar, When they acquired Pixar, they maintained a lot of autonomy for that business unit, and that helped them retain the valuable employees and create a lot of value with that acquisition. If they had moved very quickly and more aggressively and maybe changed the culture more or co-located the employees with Disney employees, they may have lost a lot of valuable talent. The culture may have been damaged. A lot of the value of the acquisition might have been destroyed. They could try to reverse that decision by then going back and increasing autonomy and trying to repair the culture. But damage like that can be very hard to undo, especially if you've lost valuable employees and they've gone elsewhere. So there's a lot of reasons to be cautious and take your time with integration to try to minimize those cost or those time compression diseconomies. That brings us to the resource pathways framework. Hopefully you're pretty familiar with this by this point. As we've discussed in previous sessions, to do this framework, you need to start out with some idea of the corporate strategy. Probably that involves figuring out the synergies you're hoping to create. Then you need to define the strategic resource gap. So the specific resources you need to execute your strategy that as a firm you don't already have access to. If building is not optimal, again, all of these pathways have knowledge questions and governance questions. If you've rejected building, contracting, and alliances, the next and final pathway is acquisition. As with the others, there's two questions for this. The first is the clear integration map. There are two categories of problems that can really go wrong with this integration map. The first is if you don't have a clearly defined strategy and a clearly defined strategic resource gap. That's relevant for answering all the questions along the way. But if you are buying a very large company, you're incurring a lot of risk. You really need to have a clear understanding of what it is that you're buying and why you're buying it. So having that clear idea of the strategic resource gap you're filling is an important part of the integration map. The other important part of the integration map is identifying those resources that you're acquiring that you were not originally planning to. If you identify a strategic resource gap and then go out and find a company that has those resources, it's very unlikely that you'll find a target company that has exactly those resources you're missing and nothing else. So in addition to those resources you're trying to obtain, any company is going to have a lot of other resources as well, and you need to create a plan for those. Perhaps you can create new synergies that you were not originally expecting. Perhaps they have some business units that can kind of be left alone and can continue to function more independently, or you may need to divest some of those resources. So once you identify a potential target, you're not only thinking about the resources that you're hoping to obtain to fill that resource gap, you're also figuring out what to do with all the other resources. And you need to have those figured out in order for an acquisition to make sense. The other question, the governance question, is about employee motivation. There are a lot of things that can affect employee motivation in an acquisition. Sometimes an acquisition may actually be seen as a positive. When I was at Oracle, we bought a lot of companies, and sometimes they were companies that had been struggling for a number of years, had not been able to give raises for years, and things were just not great prior to the acquisition. So sometimes you actually have very high motivation. Other times, this is probably more common, there can be a loss of motivation. Some of that, or usually that involves things that they like about their old job that are being taken away. It might be as basic as the size of the office they used to have or the holiday schedule they used to have, and those are being taken away. They may be unhappy about that. It could be much more interpersonal. A lot of times employees are going to be laid off, and those that remain may be upset about losing friends and colleagues and coworkers. Even if that's not happening, or you don't know that that's happening, there's always uncertainty. So if you acquire a company, people are going to be very nervous. They'll be anxious about what's going to happen to them, especially if they have responsibilities, mortgages to pay, rent to pay, food to buy, anything like that. Creates a lot of stress and anxiety for acquisition employees. So it's very important to do what you can to mitigate that, especially when the value of the company you're buying is based on the employees and their tacit knowledge and their unique abilities. Sometimes you are buying a company for something more tangible, like intellectual property or physical resources of some type, and maybe employee motivation is not important or less important there. But often when you're buying a company, it's because they're able to do something that you are not able to do, and you need to maintain that tacit knowledge in order to integrate it into your own company. And if those employees all quit, you've essentially paid a lot of money for a company that no longer has the resource you were hoping to obtain. So if you have a clear integration map and high employee motivation, then the acquisition pathway is viable. In the book, if you've looked at that, it's available as an ebook through the library's electronic course reserves. They do go into different other combinations. So if you just have an integration map, or you just have high employee motivation, for the purposes of this course, we're going to keep it simple though. If you have both of these, the acquisition path is viable. If you don't, for our purposes, we'll consider it not viable. So if feasibility is low, then you get to this very last step, which is either going through all the steps again, which I think is a little weird that they include that, because hopefully you went through the steps correctly the first time. The other alternative is redefining the strategy. If you take any company out there, there's a nearly infinite range of resources that can be acquired and recombined in new, unique ways. So if you are creating a strategy that relies on resources that you have no viable pathway for obtaining, it probably makes sense to redefine that strategy to depend on resources that you do have a prospect of obtaining. This last step, the redefining strategy, is always easy to forget, but it's worth keeping in mind that that is an option if none of the other pathways make sense. All right, one last slide on acquisitions before we shift to divestitures. One of the assigned readings for today was about deliberate learning in post-merger integration. A lot of times that's referred to as learning to acquire. There's also related work that talks about learning how to divest. Essentially, learning how to get better and better at acquisitions is something that's very hard for companies. They're relatively infrequent. Even with large frequent acquirers, you're not usually buying more than one company a month. So if an employee is there for a year, they might have some exposure to 12 acquisitions, but if they're exposed to all 12, they'll usually have very little deep understanding of any one of those. Other employees might be deeply involved with one acquisition, and that's an even smaller base to try to learn from. So learning how to do acquisitions well is difficult. The solution proposed by the authors of this paper is deliberate learning, which is a concept that's been taken from a lot of research on how learning works in the human mind in general. Essentially what they argue for is breaking down tasks that make up the merger and acquisition process and identifying the effects of each of those tasks on intermediate outcomes. An example of that is the due diligence process. Often companies have a specific list of things that they're looking for before closing an acquisition. If they then close that acquisition and they find out information that was important to know that they did not discover, even if the merger ends up being successful down the road, the fact that they have this intermediate outcome provides feedback on how the due diligence process can be improved going forward. So by taking this very large interdependent process with thousands of decisions, and thinking about the effects of each of those becomes easier to learn and improve more quickly, even if every acquisition takes a year or two before you know whether it was successful overall. Interestingly, the authors argued that this codification, where you're taking down all of these lessons and documenting them, it may not be the actual documents that are creating value. When I was at Oracle, you would sometimes see these 800-page manuals of what to do with an acquisition. I would be surprised if anybody had read those. Often they were written by multiple people writing different sections, and I'm guessing that some of them did not even read the other sections. So it's possible that this codification is not creating value through the documents, but instead it's the people thinking about the decisions that they made and how those decisions turned out that creates learning and the development of tacit knowledge at the individual level. This tacit knowledge can interact with the codification and the creation of new checklists or processes to also create organizational learning that is embedded through organizational routines. So if you are in charge of due diligence and over time you learn what works and what doesn't work, you will implement these policies that will mean that you always do things the same way with every acquisition. Even if that employee who learned those lessons the hard way leaves the company, everybody that's still there will know this is the way we always do due diligence. And essentially that lesson has been permanently learned by the organization, even if the employees who actually did the learning are no longer at the company. So that's what they're talking about in terms of developing organizational routines and how that embeds learning in the organization. That brings us to divestitures. The question for divestitures, if you want to think about it in pop cultural terms, is does this business unit spark joy? If not, you can trade it in for a box of cash, as Marie Kondo here is doing. In terms of divestitures, we're going to be talking about two specific types in this class. This is somewhat of a simplification of all the consideration that can go into this. We'll be talking about sell-offs and spin-offs. And for the purposes of our discussions, a sell-off is taking a business unit and selling it to some other company, often for cash, although it can be, again, more complicated than that, often for tax reasons. A spin-off is taking a business unit and turning it into a new independent company. Typically, that's structured by sharing the equity in that new business with existing shareholders. So if a shareholder owns 1% of the company, the total company before the spin-off, after the spin-off, they'll own 1% of what's left, as well as 1% of the new business. And at that point, depending on what they're interested in, they may keep both of those stakes. They may sell one of those and buy more in the other. They can pretty much do whatever they want as owners of stakes in each of those at that point. There are a lot of more complicated variations, things like equity carve-outs and split-ups. Also, even on sell-offs and spin-offs, the book will go into more detail about tax implications and making decisions based on things like that. For this course, we're just going to keep it simple. I also want to distinguish divestiture from outsourcing. Outsourcing essentially is the opposite of vertical integration. Instead of taking some part of the value chain that was outside the company and bringing it in, you're taking some part of the value chain that's within the company and pushing it out. Often that's done by hiring somebody to do the manufacturing, but companies also hire contractors for often security work, janitorial work, food service, a lot of things that are not central to how a firm is creating value will be outsourced. The corporate strategy book has an entire chapter on that. But again, in this class, we're just going to be focusing on divestiture, which is having a value chain or a business unit that was part of the company, and then either you sell that to some other company or you spin it off into its own standalone company. We're also going to use a simplified decision tree to think about which of those modes is most appropriate. The first question you can think about is whether there is a better parent for the business unit. In this case, you can think of better parent being a company that values that business unit more than you value it, inclusive of all the synergies that you're expecting to create. So you have a net present value for this business unit that incorporates all the synergies you expect. If you can sell that business unit to somebody else for more than that net present value, then you're increasing the value of your firm. And you should always do that. Again, that's inclusive of fees and taxes and anything like that. But if you can get more cash than the business unit is worth to you, you should go for that. If you remember back to one of the earlier slides on acquisitions, I talked about how the selling company gets their value or their share of the new synergies in cash up front, whereas the buyer is incurring all of the uncertainty and risk around whether or not those synergies will actually be created. So if you're able to create something that's, or take something that's uncertain in its value and get concrete cash value for that, it's a good idea. If there's not a better parent, then it gets a little bit more complicated. First, if the synergy test fails, if you're not creating synergistic value with that business unit, then you should get rid of it. And because there's not a better parent, that means spinning it off into its own standalone business. If there is not a better parent and you are creating synergies, this equity carve-out should be dropped from there. We're not talking about that in this class, but you could keep that business unit, or you could still spin it off into a standalone business. That might not seem obvious. If you're creating value, why would you get rid of it? That goes back to what we talked about in terms of governance costs earlier in the term. I think that was session 2. Some synergies are created most efficiently when managed within a single firm. Other synergies are more efficiently managed between firms. That would be when the transaction costs are lower than the ownership costs. If transaction costs are lower than ownership costs and you currently own that business unit, you can spin it off and create the same synergies at a lower cost going forward, which is why you would potentially spin off a business unit that you are creating synergies with. All right, just 2 more slides on divestitures. First, I'll briefly talk about legacy divestitures. A legacy divestiture is when you are selling off or spinning off the oldest part of your firm, business unit that maybe is not as exciting, not growing as quickly, maybe not your main source of profits anymore, but that used to be your core, or that is the oldest part of the company. There's a reason why this is risky, and that is because organizations evolve over time, and every decision you make is based on all of your previous decisions. This oldest business unit, by virtue of being there the longest, will have affected a lot of downstream decisions, and a lot of very mundane synergies might exist with that business unit that would be easy to miss from the outside. To take one super simple example of that, we've talked about consolidation synergies, where you may have a single purchasing department that supports the entire firm, and the number of purchasing analysts is smaller because of that. So you're creating consolidation synergies. Often that will exist in the oldest part of the business because that they've always had their purchasing department. If you sell off that business unit, then you need to figure out how to move all those people around so that both the sold off business and what remains have their purchasing people. There may be some purchasing analysts that are purchasing on behalf of both. If you lose them either for the old unit or for what's left, they may have information about what suppliers are reliable, who to go to get different types of problems fixed, things like that. So a lot of these interdependencies are very basic. They're not very exciting. They just have to do with the way organizations evolve over time. but by breaking up the company, you lose out on some of this interdependence and things can go wrong quickly. The challenge is that knowledge about this interdependence is tacit. If you've been with the company for 20 years, you know who to call when a certain problem comes up, and you can just pick up the phone and call that person and figure out how to fix the problem. Financial markets are not very able to identify those types of interdependencies, and even new executives coming out from the outside may not appreciate them. So often these investors or new executives will want to divest that legacy unit, again, for very rational reasons. It may be the least profitable, the slowest growing, things like that. But they can create a lot of unexpected problems by doing that. So again, legacy divestitures is something you have to be very, very careful with. In terms of divestitures overall, they're a very important part of the innovative process. Often, even with an acquisition, part of the acquisition plan, that integration roadmap is figuring out what resources should be divested. Corporate strategy in general is about acquiring new resources, recombining them in new ways, selling off or spinning off resources you no longer need. So it's all part of this kind of living process as organizations grow and change over time. Because this divestiture process is foreseeable, you can design organizations with that in mind. And this returns to the idea of modularity that we've discussed a few times in this course. Just a refresher on that, modularity is limiting interdependence between business units to create flexibility. As we talked about before with inter-temporal economies of scope, limiting this interdependence creates flexibility, but at the sacrifice of some intra-temporal economies of scope. This article goes into a little more detail on how to manage that. Specifically, the interdependence is managed by the corporate headquarters so that they're fully aware of the interdependence between business units and the specific synergies that are being created. That allows them to both diagnose how damaging selling off a unit might be. They're fully aware of all the interdependence, so you don't have that legacy divestiture problem. Also, by being aware of it, they can continue to manage that interdependence post sell-off or spin-off. So I mentioned earlier that you may spin off business units that you are creating synergies with, and you can continue to create those synergies with transaction costs instead of ownership costs, and continue to create that value with lower governance costs overall. So having a headquarters that is managing all this interdependence facilitates that. So modularity here essentially works the same as what we've talked about previously, but it's specifically in the context of divestiture.